O.J. Simpson is a name that rarely comes up in football conversations today, for obvious reasons. The Hall of Fame running back who turned out to be a terrible human being. But once upon a time, he was the most unstoppable force in the NFL. Known simply as the Juice, he ran with a rare blend of power and finesse that left defenses scrambling, and for a brief but unforgettable window from 1972 to 1976, he was untouchable. 4 rushing titles in 5 years, an MVP award, and a spot at the top of the record books. So just how good was O.J. Simpson? Where does his incredible yet short-lived peak rank among the all-time greats? Simpson's speed, a 4.3 second 40-yard dash, made him a constant big play threat. But he wasn't just fast, he was powerful enough to pound through defenders into a stacked box. At USC, he was a part of the 4x110-yard relay team that set a world record time of 38.6 seconds. Fast? Absolutely. But what really set him apart was his ability to cut without losing a step, slipping through tackles with ease. I played with him 4 years, and I'd be willing to bet I could count on one hand the number of times he was actually tackled. However, success was anything but guaranteed for OJ. At age 2 he contracted rickets, which left him with skinny bow-legged legs. By age 13 he was a part of a fighting gang. But when he wasn't getting into trouble, OJ played sports at the local rec center. This is where the world first got to see his talent, but trouble was never far away. He'd be arrested a few times by high school. After the 3rd arrest, a friend asked baseball legend Willie Mays to intervene. Mays took the time to speak with OJ, helping to get him back on track. Yet, even with his talent, OJ's grades were so low that he didn't receive any college scholarship offers. So he'd have to work his way up. He joined City College of San Francisco and made a name for himself. He was then able to transfer to USC in his junior year. His 2 years there would be truly phenomenal. Simpson was not only the greatest player I ever had, he was the greatest player anyone ever had, said John McKay, his coach at USC. He finished second in the Heisman vote in 1967 and was arguably snubbed of the award. OJ led the conference in yards from scrimmage, over 700 more than the next player. His performance against the Bruins that year, led by Gary Beban, who beat him for the Heisman, was epic. The Trojans were trailing in the 4th until OJ sealed the victory with a 64-yard touchdown run in what was dubbed the game of the century. What looked like a 5-yard run turned into a 60-plus yard run. In 1968, he'd again lead the conference in scrimmage yards and touchdowns, but this time won the Heisman by a then largest margin of victory of 1,750 votes. In the 1968 Rose Bowl against Indiana, there was actually a Vegas line for OJ to outscore the opposing team, and USC won 14-3 with OJ scoring both touchdowns. He led the country in rushing yards both years at USC. He rushed for at least 100 yards in 17 of his 21 college games, and more than 200 yards 5 times. No surprise, such dominance would get him selected number 1 overall by the Bills in the 1969 draft. The Bills offered a 5-year, $250,000 contract, which Simpson refused. He asked for a 5-year, $650,000 contract, plus a $500,000 loan. They'd reach an agreement, but interestingly, OJ recalls a conversation where his agent said to the owner, Ralph Wilson, OJ can turn this team around and make them a championship team. Wilson responded, "What good would a championship do me? All that means is everybody wants a raise." That might explain why the Bills would be so miserable during OJ's career. In 9 seasons, the Bills went 43, 81, and 2, with only 3 winning seasons and just 1 playoff appearance. The Heisman Trophy winner didn't hit the ground running. He averaged just 642 yards and 4 touchdowns in his first 3 seasons, and the Bills finished with a combined record of 8-33. In 1972, with the hiring of coach Lou Saban, things started to change. Saban had actually been the coach from 1962 to 1965 and won back-to-back championships with the Bills. For some reason, OJ's previous coaches didn't want to build an offense around him. These are his attempts before Saban, and this is after he became head coach. And in his first year with him, he'd rush for over 1,200 yards and 6 touchdowns, leading the league in rushing, which he'd also do in 1973, 1975, and 1976. The fact he was doing this on a mostly miserable Bills team makes it extra impressive. This is their passing yard and touchdown ranking during OJ's peak from 1972 to 1976. Bear in mind there were only 26 teams till 1975 and 28 teams from 1976 onwards. Aside from 1975, the Bills were an average at best, dumpster fire at worst offense. Their passing attack would peak in 1975, with quarterback Joe Ferguson improving. He led the league in touchdown passes that year. But then he'd get injured halfway through the 1976 season, and it took him some time to recover. And because OJ's prime was 1972 to 1976, OJ only really had 1 good year of quarterback play. And we can't forget the defense. 3 of these years, OJ had one of the worst defenses in the league, and the other 2, he was lucky to have a slightly above average defense. Despite the team's shortcomings, the O-line was great. nicknamed the Electric Company, as they turned on the juice. It fully came together following the 1973 draft. In the first round, the Bills selected tight end Paul Seymour, a great blocker. They then drafted future Hall of Fame guard Joe DeLarmelore, and also this was the year they drafted Joe Ferguson. The impact of the new and improved blocking would be clear from game 1, as the Bills faced off against the Patriots, and OJ ran for 250 yards and 2 touchdowns. And this would be the year OJ recorded the crowning NFL achievement for a running back, the first player to rush for over 2,000 yards. And he did it in 14 games. His 143.1 rushing yards per game is still the record by 10 yards. The only player who really matched this achievement was Barry Sanders. Barry Sanders rushed for 53 yards in his first 2 games, and then proceeded to rush for another 2,000 in his 14 remaining. The Bills' offense was all OJ, put simply. The team threw for 4 touchdowns and just over 1,200 yards. The entire year. Joe Ferguson had a 45.8 quarterback rating. Their best receiver, Bob Chandler, finished with 427 yards and 3 touchdowns. And here's an interesting stat. Any game OJ ran for more than 120 yards was a win for the Bills. Any game he ran for less than 120 was a loss. The record-breaking moment would come down to the final minutes of the last regular season game. The Bills faced the Jets on a bitter, snowy day. OJ needed 197 yards to break the record, and spoiler, he did, finishing with 200 yards. He'd be carried off the field as they celebrated this accomplishment, and OJ headed to the locker room. The thing is, there was still about 5 minutes left on the clock, so OJ could have added a few more yards to the total. His 2,003 yards surpassed Jim Brown's 1,863 and would stand for over a decade until Eric Dickerson would steal the crown. No surprise, OJ would go on to win the 1973 MVP award. It's worth noting that in 1972, the hash marks were narrowed to open up the outside run game. The NFL widened the short side of the field, as teams would essentially use the sideline as an extra defender. Defenses were not prepared for the rule change, and it took some time to adjust. The number of 1,000-yard runners doubled from 5 to 10, and rushing yards per game did see an increase. But I don't think this makes the record any less impressive. It was important to mention, however. The Bills' offense was OJ. He was getting the ball most of the time, yet they still could not stop him. Saying all this, 1975 might be even more impressive. While a knee injury limited him to just over 1,000 yards in 1974, by the way that was still third in the league, he would be ready to go full throttle in 1975. 1,817 rushing yards, 16 rushing touchdowns, 426 receiving yards, and 7 receiving touchdowns. He finished with the second most scrimmage yards a game of all time. In 1973, he finished with 2,073 scrimmage yards versus 2,243 yards in 1975. This year, he certainly benefited from an improved passing game, as they were the number 1 overall offense. On the other side, it wasn't as strong, as the defense ranked 4th worst in the league, giving up 25.9 points per game. In 1976, Joe Ferguson was injured and missed the second half of the season, so it would be just OJ again. And the season did not go well for the Bills. But OJ did leave his mark yet again on Thanksgiving Day. He'd surpassed 1,000 rushing yards in 1976, but his best game came in an otherwise unremarkable Bills performance. He set the then single-game rushing record of 272 yards against the Lions. If you haven't caught on by now, OJ set a lot of records. The rest of his offense was as helpful as a guy with 2 broken arms offering to help take out the trash, with his quarterback completing 4 of 21 passes for 29 yards. From 1972 to 1976, he averaged 303 attempts a year. There were several years he had 40 to 50 more carries than the second highest running back. That amount of volume takes a toll on the body, and therefore the peak won't last as long. But when he was at his peak, man was he good. From 1970 to 1979, he rushed for 10,539 yards. Second during that time was Franco Harris, who was 2,000 yards behind, at 8,563 yards. Then, in 1977, the 49ers would make a terrible trade, giving Buffalo their 1978 second and third round picks, plus their 1979 first, second, and fourth round picks. The 49ers were fortunate to draft Joe Montana in the 3rd round and Dwight Clark in the 10th round of the 1979 draft though, and so that trade doesn't get remembered as much. OJ would play a limited amount of games for the 49ers due to knee injuries. The time he was on the field was not productive. 3.7 yards per carry in his first year with the 49ers, which was the worst of his career, and 3.8 the next year wasn't much better. With only 593 yards in 1978 and 460 yards in 1979, OJ knew it was time to call it quits.